Appleton Lot 1, right there. And if you look at it closely, you can see a slightly earlier technology was in place than is current. The upper photo, you're looking from what would be above the area of Memorial Drive Bridge, looking back at Lot 1. And then the lower image is a postcard from above the turn of the century, showing the site of Appleton Lot 4, which has changed quite a bit. You see a residence in place that was removed probably in the late 50s or 60s. Just some more images. Here the foxes docked along Appleton 1, and we see a coal barge moving through in the lower image. The use of the navigational locks, in addition to transportation for settlers in the earlier days, after the turn of the century, it really became a working river that was used most prominently for industry. One is right across the way. Locks 2 and 3 are sort of paired on either side of Law Street. And Appleton 4 is, what would the name of that road be, Harlan? You go down past the Lawrence Stadium. John Street. Okay. So speaking of Appleton 4, here we see one of the last industrial loads coming through Appleton Lot 4. It's a large piece of paper machinery on a barge in 1983, and this was it. I mean, the locks had been quieted. There had been very, very little industrial traffic on the river since the late 50s, and so this was a very unusual occurrence, and I imagine part of why it was documented. And then, by the mid-century, going into the 60s and 70s, there were a couple of excursion boats on the river, sort of renewing the river as a more of a recreational waterway. Next slide, please. Okay. After the Corps of Engineers discontinued use of the locks on the river, there was a lot of talk, and Harlan's going to get into this in more detail about what to do. So the Corps of Engineers did a couple of feasibility studies of sort, and one of their recommendations was the locks be closed permanently and filled, and that was met with resistance in the communities along the river and in the state. So the locks were put on the National Register in 1992, which set into play necessary mitigation if the federal government were essentially going to close the locks and abandon them. So a lot of documentation was done around that time, and these images are from the Historic American Engineering Record documentation, completed on all sites along the Fox in 1995. And it's really quite excellent. There's a narrative discussion of each lock site along with contemporary photographs illustrating conditions. Okay, back to Harlan.
Okay, just like to talk a little bit about the process of the locks. The locks actually were transferred from the Corps of Engineers to the state of Wisconsin in 2004. But as part of that whole process, the Fox River Navigational System Authority was formed under special state legislation, and they were responsible then for dealing with the locks once they were transferred over. And what is it? We were established in 2001 by the legislature, and the authority actually became operational upon the physical transfer of the locks from the federal government to the state in 2004. And initially what they did is they gave the authority responsibility for a 30-year period, so it went through the year 2034. Then the state would reevaluate what's happening with the system and would determine whether they would renew this agreement for the authority to continue to manage the locks or would do something else with the locks at that period of time. A board was established for the authority to direct what we're doing, and there were 2 representatives from Brown County, from Outagamie County, and Winnebago County on the board, as well as 3 state representatives. And they oversee what happens with the authority, budgetary matters, policy matters, and so forth. When the authority accepted the lock system, they were in various states of disrepair, and they hadn't been operated for a considerable period of time 1988 was the last operation. And so there was various stages of disrepair in all the lock systems. And this was all evaluated and inventoried as far as what would be done, and there were some studies that would determine what the cost would be, how they would be rehabbed, and so forth. Again, we're looking here at locks 3 and 4 in Appleton, and you can see on the gates some of the conditions, and we'll look at that in a little more detail a little bit later. But all of this information was gathered before any type of work was started. Ann, you want to talk a little bit about, let me just mention one thing, is that the authority had special provisions as a state agency in the Wisconsin statutes. And with those provisions, we were able to do certain things, both finance-wise and construction-wise, that many of the state agencies can't do. And one of those was something called DesignBuild. And with DesignBuild, it's a little different than a typical the design bid-build process, where you have an engineer develop all the plans and specs, then develop a bid package, submit the bid package out, and then the lowest price bidder is chosen to do that particular work. Okay? What that does is adds a lot of extra overhead, if you want to call it, to the process. There's the design work, and there's inspection work, and there could be 20 to 25% of a tag on the cost of development of a project. We were able to do something called DesignBuild, and this is typically something where we develop certain standards, and then we select the builder on a quality-based selection. We don't have to take the lowest price. We take those that we feel are best qualified to do it. And what happens is, though, typically because you avoid a lot of the bureaucracy, you still get a project which comes in much below the other process where it goes out to bid. And so that's kind of a unique thing that we've got that saves us a lot of money. But I'll let you answer.
Question.
Sure.
What was the source of your funds to do all this planning and repairs?
I'll touch on that in just a couple minutes.
Thanks, Harold. DesignBuild was really a very innovative approach to doing this work, and really quite effective and efficient. Basically, we began the process, I, as being part of the contractors team, which was C.R. Meyer out of Oshkosh. We all had a level of familiarity with these structures, and began by going through drawings at the Corps of Engineer office and really getting our heads around existing conditions and the functionality of the locks. Next slide, please, Liz. Okay. We had to start out, so basically, we had to really, then we had the other thing at the, I'm sorry if I'm stumbling. We had, because we had federal funding involved in paying for the work, and the locks were listed on the National Register, we really had to involve the State Historic Preservation Officer, what was determined to take place as part of the construction. So design largely was going through the historical documentation, figuring out the appearance of the lock at the close of its period of significance, and I know that's kind of jargonistic, but that was determined to be 1941 in the National Register nomination. And it signified largely the Corps of Engineers' final projects on the locks. Over time, when the locks were built in the 1850s, they were largely rubble stone construction. At about the turn of the century, most of them were, the chambers were relined with the blocks that we see at most of the sites today. A lot of the mechanical apparatus was updated. So the period of significance really determined how the locks were going to be repaired and put back together, with 1941 being our cutoff date in terms of how they were going to look and function. We had to bring, we have a photo in the lower right corner that was Kevin, the project manager from C.R. Meyer, conferring with Jim Drager and Chip Brown. Chip was largely responsible to review treatment approaches. Harlan will get into this in more detail, but for each material type, we pretty much had to come up with a treatment plan right past the SHPO before it could be implemented. But this saved doing all of the drawings and more traditional type of design that would have taken months and months and months, and I think sort of leapfrogging that really represented a huge savings to the project. Next slide, please. So we, again, because this was federally funded, National Register site, we had to go through a Section 106 process. A lot of the work done in the 90s, and that the Corps really initiated in their environmental impact studies and such, amassed a huge amount of documentation, and that was really an excellent starting point for the work involving the actual restoration of locks. When we got into looking at them specifically, sort of lock by lock, we really had to understand, well, when was this type of mechanical apparatus put in? When were these valves changed out? And it became very, very specific. We used Appleton Lot 1 as sort of a prototype for figuring out the basic component parts and pieces and figuring out the evolution of each of these, and then just really understanding how they work so we could reinstate the authenticity to each of the sites. Next slide, please. Okay, so following all the upfront work that we did, that wasn't really upfront, that's kind of a misnomer. We were really sort of all working in the trenches together. The actual construction process began, and I'm going to turn it back to Harlan to describe that.
As I mentioned earlier on the design process, what we did is we set standards, sort of performance standards, for what the contractor had to do. And part of those standards were, in essence, what we call a replacement standard. Unless there was something in there that was out of character with the historic significance of the lot, what we did is we said this part needs to be either repaired or replaced as is. So that kind of set the basis for the construction approach on the lots themselves. Obviously, there were certain historic things that had to be looked at and met. But in essence, this was like a big repair project, and the Corps had been doing this about every 20 years on each of the lots from inception. Okay, so if we had, for example, tuck pointing that you see up on top, which is going in and remortaring the joints on the stones, typically that was done on a lot every 20 years. Same way with things like gate replacement, those mechanical repairs and so forth. And they cycled this out, and they generally did a lock a year, approximately. We had 17 locks. Did a lock a year and just kept going down the chain. And then by the time they got done, they went back and did another one. So the Corps did all its own work over time. So in essence, all we were doing was continuing that process when we were doing the restoration, with the exception that there was about a 20 to 30 year, about a 30 to 35 year gap between the last time it had been done on a lock and when we started. So different types of things. We had timber gates removed. We worked on the lock tender shelters and so forth. Next slide. And here you can see some of the early problems that we had, some of the conditions that we were dealing with, where we had obviously see graffiti and stuff. We had the lock operator shed. We had the gates in a deteriorated situation, rotted. We had the mechanicals, the railings and stuff that were rusted. So we had all of this, and they looked terrible. But the problem with it is if you went in and looked and you went to a typical person and you had them look at that lot, they'd say, in no way should we stick any money in that lot. Okay, it's deteriorated. What we ought to do is just fill it in and get out. But they were constructed at a time when the basic structural elements of that lot were still there. The walls were there, the bottoms, the heavy mechanical stuff was all still good. We had rotted stuff, we had paint, things that needed to be painted, tuck pointed, repaired, and that's really what we were undertaking. And here you can see, for example, this is some of the masonry cleaning and repair. Because we had a crew that came in, cleaned the joints, went back in and then filled the joints. And you'll see on the side here where we have the completed tuck pointed joints. And here you can see metal reconditioning.